You've asked the question before, and not just once, but in those quiet moments when your mind drifts and something deeper starts to surface, you ask yourself, what starseed am I? And maybe you searched for it, maybe you watched a few videos, maybe you read through traits and descriptions, trying to find something that fits, something that explains why you've always felt slightly out of place, even in spaces where you were supposed to belong. But if you slow down for a second, and you stop trying to figure it out, and you just pay attention to that first moment when you came across the idea, you'll realize something was already there. Because this wasn't just curiosity, and it wasn't random, and it definitely wasn't something you forced yourself to believe. It felt familiar in a way that didn't make sense, and instead of questioning the feeling, you started questioning yourself. You told yourself you were overthinking, and you told yourself you were just trying to find meaning where there isn't any, and so you kept searching, not because you didn't know, but because you didn't trust what you felt the first time. And that's the part no one really talks about, because the moment you asked the question wasn't the beginning of your search, it was the moment something in you quietly recognized itself, and instead of accepting it, you decided to look for proof. So now you're here, still asking the same question, still looking for something to confirm it, while a part of you has already gone quiet, not confused, not lost, just waiting for you to stop ignoring what you already know. Most people think they're searching for information when they start asking questions like this, and on the surface, it looks that way, because you open tabs, you read descriptions, and you compare traits, hoping something will finally click in a clear and logical way. But this isn't really about information, and it never was, because information doesn't usually feel this personal, and it doesn't stay with you after you close the screen, and it definitely doesn't follow you into those quiet moments when you're not even trying to think about it. What you're experiencing is different, and if you pay attention, you'll notice that it doesn't behave like normal curiosity, because normal curiosity fades once you get an answer, but this lingers, and it keeps coming back, and it feels like something unfinished. And that's because you didn't randomly arrive at this question, and you didn't just stumble into it by accident, because people don't start questioning their entire sense of identity unless something deeper has already been triggered beneath the surface. There was a moment, whether you remember it clearly or not, when something shifted slightly, and maybe it was subtle, and maybe you ignored it at first, but from that point on, things didn't feel the same anymore, and you couldn't fully go back to the way you used to see yourself or the world around you. So what looks like a search is actually something else entirely, because you're not trying to learn something new, you're trying to make sense of something that already feels familiar, even if you don't fully understand why. And that's why no amount of external explanation ever feels complete, because what you're looking for isn't just an answer, it's confirmation of a feeling that didn't start with what you read, but with something you felt long before you had the words for it. But the moment that feeling starts to settle in, something else follows right behind it, and it doesn't come loudly or aggressively, but it's persistent, and it slowly begins to question everything you just felt. Because now your mind steps in, and it starts trying to make sense of it in a way that feels safe and familiar, and that's when the doubts begin to form, not all at once, but gradually, like a quiet voice that keeps returning. You start asking yourself if you're just imagining things, and you wonder if maybe you're reading too deeply into something that doesn't actually mean anything, and even though the feeling hasn't gone away, you begin to distrust it anyway. So instead of sitting with it, you start searching more, and not in a calm way, but in a restless way, because now you're not just curious, you're trying to prove something, and at the same time, you're trying to disprove it. You go through different types, and you compare traits, and for a moment, something feels right, but then the doubt returns again, and it tells you it's probably just coincidence, or that you're forcing it, or that you just want it to be true. And the more you do this, the more disconnected you start to feel, because now you're moving further away from the original feeling, and closer to something that feels analytical, controlled, and uncertain. But what makes this confusing is that the feeling never actually disappears, because even while you're doubting it, even while you're questioning it, there's still a part of you that stays quiet, not arguing, not reacting, just present. And that's the part you keep overlooking, because it doesn't fight for your attention, and it doesn't try to convince you of anything, so it's easy to ignore, especially when everything else in your mind is louder. So now you find yourself in this strange place, where you're searching for answers outside of you, while something inside of you has already stopped searching. The reason this feels so difficult to figure out is because you've been approaching it the way you approach everything else, and that is by trying to understand it, define it, and confirm it through something external, something you can point to and say, this is it, this is the answer. But this was never something you were meant to figure out in that way, because the moment you turn it into something that needs to be proven, you move further away from what made it feel real in the first place. What you felt at the beginning wasn't confusion, and it wasn't uncertainty, even though it might look like that now, because if you go back to that first moment, there was no analysis there, and there was no effort, and there was no need to compare or question. There was just a quiet sense of familiarity, something that didn't demand your attention, but still held it, something that didn't try to explain itself, but still made sense in a way you couldn't put into words. And that's the part that changes everything, because what you experienced wasn't something new entering your awareness, it was something already within you becoming noticeable for the first time, and instead of allowing it to exist as it was, you tried to translate it into something logical. But recognition doesn't behave like logic, and it doesn't follow the same rules, because logic needs clarity, and recognition only needs presence, and that's why it feels so subtle, and so easy to overlook. You're expecting something louder, something more obvious, something that clearly tells you, this is who you are, but what you're actually given is something much quieter, something that doesn't force itself on you, but waits for you to become still enough to notice it again. And maybe that's why it keeps slipping away, not because it isn't there, but because every time it appears, you immediately try to turn it into something you can explain, instead of letting it remain something you simply recognize. And maybe the hardest part about all of this is realizing that the feeling never truly left you, because even after all the doubt, all the questioning, and all the searching, there is still something inside of you that quietly reacts whenever you come across something that feels familiar. Not excited in the way people usually describe excitement, and not emotional in an obvious way, but still deeply affected, almost like a part of you recognizes something before your mind has the chance to explain it. And that reaction is subtle enough to dismiss, which is exactly why most people ignore it, because we've been taught to trust things that are loud, immediate, and easy to prove, while the things that are quiet and deeply personal are often treated like imagination. So when that feeling appears, you instinctively pull away from it, and you start trying to analyze it instead, because analysis feels safer than acceptance, and questioning yourself feels more logical than trusting something you can't fully explain. But the strange thing is that no matter how much you question it, you keep coming back to it anyway, and that's important, because people rarely return to something over and over again unless some part of them is still searching for recognition within it. And maybe that's why this feels exhausting sometimes, because one part of you already feels connected to something deeper, while another part keeps demanding proof before it allows you to believe it. So you stay caught between those two worlds, constantly searching for certainty outside of yourself, while something within you has already become tired of searching altogether. Because deep down, beneath all the analysis and the doubt, there is a quiet part of you that already knows what resonates with you and what doesn't, and it recognizes certain things instantly, not through logic, but through familiarity. And after a while, you begin to realize that the constant searching was never really about finding an answer, because if it were, you would have stopped the moment something resonated deeply with you. But that's not what happened, because every time something felt familiar, you immediately stepped back from it, and instead of accepting the feeling, you started testing it, questioning it, and trying to decide whether you were allowed to believe it in the first place. And maybe that's the real struggle underneath all of this, because it isn't confusion that keeps you searching, it's hesitation. A hesitation to trust yourself. A hesitation to believe that something so quiet could still be real, even without proof, and even without anyone else confirming it for you. Because the truth is, most people are comfortable trusting external answers, but they become deeply uncomfortable especially when it challenges the way they've always been taught to see reality. So you keep waiting for certainty to arrive in a perfect and undeniable form, while ignoring the fact that the deepest things you've ever felt in your life probably never arrived that way either. You didn't need proof to know when something felt wrong, and you didn't need proof to feel connected to certain people, certain places, or certain moments that somehow felt familiar for reasons you couldn't explain. You simply felt it. And maybe this is no different. So maybe the question was never really, what starseed am I? Because if you're honest, that question alone was never enough to satisfy what you were truly searching for. What you really wanted was clarity, and not just clarity about a label or a type, but clarity about yourself, about why you've always felt slightly disconnected from the world around you, even during moments when everything in your life looked completely normal from the outside. And maybe that's why this journey feels so personal, because it touches something deeper than curiosity, something tied to identity, memory, emotion, and that quiet feeling you've carried for years without fully understanding it. But the more you force yourself to find certainty in external answers alone, the more distant that feeling seems to become, because some things are not meant to be solved intellectually before they are understood internally. And that doesn't mean you stop exploring, and it doesn't mean you blindly believe everything you come across, but it does mean you stop treating your own inner recognition like something untrustworthy simply because it cannot be measured or explained perfectly. Because maybe the real shift begins the moment you stop asking, how do I prove this? And start asking yourself a different question entirely. Why did this feel familiar the first time I encountered it? Why did something inside me react before I even had the words to understand what I was feeling? And why, after all this time, does this still stay with me? Maybe the answer was never trying to force its way into your awareness, because maybe it has been sitting quietly beneath the surface the entire time, waiting for you to become still enough to finally listen to it instead of arguing with it. And maybe that's all you really needed right now, not another list of traits, and not another voice trying to tell you exactly who you are, but simply a moment to stop fighting the feeling long enough to acknowledge that it exists. Because whether you fully understand it yet or not, something in you connected with this for a reason, and even if you can't explain that reason perfectly, it doesn't make the experience meaningless. Sometimes the deepest truths in our lives arrive quietly, and instead of demanding our attention, they wait patiently for us to become aware of them in our own time. So don't rush to force an answer tonight, and don't pressure yourself to figure everything out immediately, because this was never about reaching a conclusion as quickly as possible. It was about becoming honest enough to notice what you've been feeling beneath the surface all along. And if something in this video felt familiar to you, then maybe don't ignore that feeling this time. Just sit with it for a while, and let yourself listen without immediately trying to explain everything away. And if you want to share something, don't tell me what you think you are, tell me what you felt the very first time you realized you were different.